Hello, everybody. I'm Gary Bergcross, along with James Overton, co-organizer of this year's Ontology Summit, which is dealing with broadly the topic of making or helping scientists and researchers use ontologies, make it easier for them to use ontologies. Today we have some short presentations, sort of a panel of three people who are going to present, in some cases on things that we sort of overlooked and wanted to sort of have an addition in the context of the prior presentations, or if a person was unable to present prior, we have one of that follow-up. And on an important topic that came up, we have a follow-up from Torsten. So with that, let me introduce the three speakers. I'm going to do it in reverse order, leading up to our first speaker. So let me start with our third speaker. It's Torsten Hahmann. He's an associate professor of spatial informatics at the School of Computing and Information Sciences at the National Center for Geographic Information Analysis at the University of Maine in Orono. Previously, he worked as a postdoc researcher at the University of Toronto in Autodesk research on various aspects of ontology-based knowledge representations within the Parametric Human Project. Torsten's expertise lies in the intersection of formal ontologies and heterogeneous representations of space. His current research projects include an NSF-funded project on empowering multi-conceptual spatial reasoning and a repository of qualitative and quantitative spatial ontologies. He also was involved in a long-term collaborative project with the Geological Survey of Canada on formally capturing the semantics of different kinds of water features like lakes, rivers, and so forth. He also leads the development of a MacLeod toolkit for automated reasoning ontologies specified in common logic. We may hear a little bit about that. Torsten was presented here in the summit before, has earned a PhD from the University of Toronto lab under Michael Gruninger. His dissertation was called A Reconciliation of Logical Theories of Space from Multidimensional Topology to Geometry. And it's about novel spatial ontologies that bridge qualitative and geometric conceptualizations of physical space, their formal semantic integration, and their semi-automatic verification. So Torsten can speak to us on a number of things. Our second speaker is Dr. Asiyah Lin, who has a PhD in medical informatics from Kobe University in Japan, an MB in pediatrics, and an MSc in immunology from Kanjing Medical College, China, which makes her an ontologist trained in immunology, pediatrics, and informatics. She's now a senior data scientist in the Office of Data Science and Emerging Technologies, or ODSET, at NIAID. Her career spans a range of roles at academic institutions, at private startups, and in government. Finally, our first speaker, introduced last, is Sierra Moxon, who is a data architect and software developer working at Berkeley Lab on Berkeley Bioinformatics open source projects, or having the wonderful acronym BBOP. Her experience includes model organism knowledge bases, the Alliance of Genome Resources, Intermine, and agricultural biotechnology. Besides BioLink modeling, which we'll hear more about today, her current projects include the MONIC Initiative, the Alliance of Genome Resources, the Gene Ontology, and NCATST Translator. Today, she will be talking to us about LinkML. And with that, let me turn it over to Sierra, and welcome.
Hi, thank you for the great invitation and also for the great introduction. That was fun. So yeah, my name is Sierra. I work for Chris Mungle and his group, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the LinkML, linked data modeling language. And it's just going to be a brief introduction, but if I spark your interest and you want to hear more about a particular topic, please feel free to reach out. We have monthly community meetings, and I'd be happy to link you up with some more developers if you have more interest. So what is LinkML? LinkML is really a modeling framework. It consists of two main things or products. One is the standard, the language with which we use to describe our models in LinkML. If you think of LinkML as just another modeling framework, you could make parallels to an SQL or a relational database schema. In those frameworks, you might have classes or tables and columns, and in LinkML, you have classes and slots. In JSON schema, you might talk about objects and attributes. Again, in LinkML, the standard really talks about classes and slots. The other half of our framework is the tools that we've developed in order to work with data that is conformant to a LinkML model, or to translate your LinkML model between these different frameworks. So we have validators that validate data according to LinkML. We have converters that take a LinkML schema written in YAML and produce the JSON schema or OWL equivalent of that model. We also have data that helps you generate code. So for example, if you write a model in LinkML, you can generate the Python classes that you need to use that model in practice in an API or in a downstream software component. And we even have tools that allow you to enter data according to a LinkML model. So automatic tools that you can spin up to enter data according to your model. And really, we've written this standard and this framework as a computable standard. We want to be able to act on our models with computers instead of using humans in the middle as an interpretation layer between different models. We want to bridge gaps in expertise. So we want to let people that are experts at biology be able to talk in the same language as people who are experts in technology. And we want to fit into existing technical frameworks. So while we would love it if people started with LinkML from the start, if you do already have a technical architecture, you can transform your LinkML model into the right layer of that application. As I mentioned, you can output JSON schema if you needed to validate data import to your model via JSON. But the best way to look at LinkML is to, of course, look at examples. This is an example that I wrote as a software developer, so take that with a grain of salt, not a biologist, but it is reflective of some of the data sets that we've seen that would benefit from LinkML models. And you can imagine, as a data researcher, that I would like to see and ask some questions about these three different biosample data sets. Can I compare the bacterial compositions of different bodies of water that are reflective in these data sets? Can I compare the bacterial compositions of these samples taken from just the epipelagic zone, just where the sunlight reaches through the water? Can I compare the bacterial compositions from saltwater samples versus freshwater samples? And right now, even though I inherently have data models in my very simple example, I don't have any way to compute over those. And it really takes a human to tell you that Lake Albert is a lake in Oregon, which is where I'm from. That is the only saltwater lake in Oregon. Of course, we know what the Pacific Ocean is, but we have no ontology here to really show how an ocean compares to a lake. And I know Crater Lake is a very deep freshwater lake. So we can use ontologies here to better characterize our sample data sets, but really there's more to it than just the ontology terms that we'd use to describe them. We want to know how we can compare these depth measurements. We can see that some of them have units and some don't. Some are in inches, some are in centimeters, and we might even have more attributes to our samples besides this, like salinity or type, right? And so, with LinkML, the first thing you would do when you're looking at making a model for these very simple data sets is to pick a framework to write your model in. And here I show an example of one that's written in SQL, for example, which is great. We might have ontologies here that characterize the kind of sample that we're using. But when we get into the representation of the rest of the attributes, we still have a modeling framework that requires some human interoperability and human intuition to be able to tell us what kind of properties that we have in our data set. For example, in this set, we might have a depth that is a float, and over here we have depth that is a foreign key, and that foreign key might point to a controlled vocabulary that represents depth like really deep or shallow or semi-shallow, which doesn't really contribute to our understanding of how depth can be compared across those two different samples. So we have a lot of frameworks like this in our domain. We have OWL, we have SQL, we have JSON schema, and depending on the hat you wear and the technology you're familiar with, kind of influences how you would store and structure that data. And the way you choose an ontology term is also very parallel to the way you would choose a framework to structure your schema, right? Does the technology have a community of people willing to support it? Is the community moving towards a feature or benefit of one technology over another? Do you have a learning curve that you're working with to learn a new framework to structure your data? And sometimes you might have to write the model in many different ways, right? You might have to write it for your relational layer, and you might have to write a similar model for your API, which is in code or in Python or in Java, and you might have to write yet another layer for your distribution framework. So the technology can really influence the model, And also the insights that we get are probably sitting right here in this middle empty ground where all of us have to work together to find the relationships between our data. And so what LinkML is really good for is sitting in that middle space. You allow people like biocurators or data scientists or developers to write the model together in one language. And then you use the tools for the LinkML framework to output the necessary serializations that you would need to fit into those different components of your technical stack. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, but LinkML also produces really great documentation. And I just can't emphasize enough how important it is when you're looking at a model to be able to read about the modeler's thoughts and processes and relationships between classes while you're trying to interpret that model for use in a different environment. So just to dive into the specification really briefly, again, we have our sample data set here. I've added a few more attributes just to explore some of the components of a LinkML model. You can see right away that a LinkML model is hierarchical. My class I've put here as biosample, trying to raise up the idea that there's more than one kind of sample from my lake data set. I have a description right next to that class. I can say right next to the definition of the class itself what I think that description should be. I list its attributes or its slots right underneath that class, and I can even tell whether or not a particular slot has many values in it, a comma-separated list, for example, in this Excel spreadsheet sort of methodology. I can also talk about whether or not a particular attribute is required or whether it can be null. And I can even describe my attributes as well as my classes. So I'm writing my descriptions right next to the things that I'm defining, which is really important. And I can also incorporate ontologies really into the base model of a LinkML model. And I can do that in a variety of ways. For example, in my biosample class, if I have an attribute depth and I want it to be the exact definition of a particular Envo ontology term, I can reference it with the slot URI field. I can say that depth is equivalent to this Envo term, and that's going to be output in the RDF serialization of our model. I can also say that, in a different way, I can say that my definition of salinity, for example, exactly maps to a Pato definition of salinity. And I can even restrict the attributes, in this case type, with an enumeration that I write. And that enumeration can be a list of permissible values, a controlled vocabulary, for example, that I define in my model itself. Or we have semantic enumerations where I can say that this type field is actually restricted to terms from a particular ontology. And one of my favorite parts is that I can import LinkML models from other LinkML models. So if you imagine my very simple example, if people had started with a LinkML model to begin with, I could have a higher level class called biosample, and both kinds of samples from my very simple model could be used in coordination with each other. So in this case, the Crater Lake sample would be a biosample, and it would inherit all the properties of my more generic biosample class. Same way the Pacific Ocean sample data set is a biosample, and it could inherit all those properties. So it can easily make a streamlined model from all these different data sets. I sort of mentioned this briefly before, but LinkML really does provide a lot of handy tools to work with your data. One of my favorites is the validation it provides. It parasitizes the JSON schema framework in this example, but there's other ways to validate your model as well. And you produce a LinkML model in YAML, translate it to JSON schema, and then voila, you have an entire framework to work with to validate data entry into your data store using JSON schema validation. And I want to mention again the LinkML documentation. It's auto-generated, it's push button. You can host it for free on GitHub. It's very user-friendly and human readable, has nice schema diagrams that let you see an overview of the way your classes are related to each other. You can navigate the model visually via links in a lot of its different components. And it's written in the same place that you write your schema. So you really only have to write documentation once, which is very, very appealing to the developers among us. Of course, I don't have enough time to go through all of the different features of LinkML, but there's a ton of them. We have a lot of development going on right now, and we'll continue to develop, and it's really being adopted by a lot of different projects and components. We even had a presentation recently from someone working on modeling the railway system in Belgium. So it's really taken off, and there's a lot of use beyond just biomedical and biological sample data. So please do reach out and get in touch if you have if you have questions or if I can expand on any of these. And thank you to everybody who's listened.
Sierra, we have 5 or 6 minutes for questions and comments. There is one in the other chat. And Kai also noted that this is similar, has some similarity to what he did for his dissertation. So maybe if Kai has a comment or maybe a pointer for us, that would be great to start off.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to. I was just kind of happy to see the pedo and vote terms being used that way in a very different interpretation of doing this. And I think had I been able to redo my PhD, I would start here. So thank you very much, Sierra, for showing all this. It's very cool. I'm looking forward to using LinkML for future projects.
I'm glad to hear it. That's
Yes.
awesome.
Potential collaboration is one of the great possibilities of the summit offers, which I would look forward to and hearing more about later on if it happens. There was a question from Ravi in the other chat. So maybe Ravi might speak up on it.
Thank you,
Question?
Gary.
Yes.
My question was obviously being answered by someone on the chat, but it is, what is it? LinkML is able to relate to all those language interfaces that you showed on one slide, where you showed JSON and other interfaces and Shackle and other languages. So how would LinkML relate to all of these is my question.
Yeah, so let me just share one more time that slide.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you see my slide again? Yeah, so LinkML is
Yes.
really two things. It's a modeling framework. It's a language that you would use to describe your model with classes and slots, etc. And then it's a set of tools that you can use to validate it. And what LinkML does is it writes, we have tools that allow you to serialize your model or translate your model into these different other existing frameworks. So you might have classes and slots in your LinkML model, but through a bit of code, you could translate that into an SQL representation of your model. So we take classes in LinkML and we translate them to tables in SQL. And you can do that with sort of like push button generation using these tools that we provide. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but you have both.
No, I think you are. Thank you. That's very good. I understand. So these tools help you translate from one to the other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I missed that. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Okay. If we have time at the end, we'll maybe have some more follow-ups, but maybe now we turn to Asiyah Lin. And as context, Asiyah was going to present at our launch because she and I collaborated on a panel at the US2TS last fall. And it was sort of an interesting discussion on, again, how to help people use ontologies, make them simpler and so forth. And we thought it would provide good context, but she was unable to present then, but we thought it would be good to have it now. And it represents some crosstalk between people like Chris Mungle and Pascal Hitzler, which is always interesting. So with that, let me turn it over to Asiyah.
Yeah, so should I share my screen?
Yes, please, if you can.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the, let me move those things.
We are able to see the FAIR slide.
Yep, you are seeing the, yeah, I have a PDF file.
First FAIR ontology.
Oh yeah, first FAIR ontology, harmonization, and the trust data interoperability workshop, which was held both at that is the US2TS panel discussion session that I'm reporting on. So yeah, I don't know how to do the PDF presentation, maybe this, yeah. So it was happened last year in September 30th at Lansing, Michigan State University. moderated by me and Gary, panelists including Pascal, Chris Mungo, Ramona Walls. And we have approximately 25 people online and in person to join the discussion. So these are the photos like showing how we were doing at that time. It was, yep. Okay, so first Ramona did talk and she was talking about what does she need to make individual data fair, because she at the Critical Path Institute, they were working on making patient level data as a knowledge graph or ontology, so that she really wants a semantic model that will include organisms, populations, things like that, and they need minimization and interoperability among various ontologies, which is a common problem we have seen. That's why we have this workshop to try to harmonize across ontologies. And then she also saying that for how do we reach the interoperable terminologies? And then the better is to have a open access with sustainable business model for all the pieces, which I don't recall. So basically this is not a technical problems. It's more like a barriers for people and community. So we need to work towards getting the agreement or the community's agreement to work on this. So next. So her point is that we need fewer ontologies. Mapping those terminologies is really complex. Of course, terms needs the IRI semantics, which makes it more fair and open access. And more importantly, I think there's a lot of hiring opening now on ontologists, but we are lack of ontologists still. So she successfully trained her internal person to be an ontologist, which is really good. And again, she preferred there is one ontology, so as me. And yes, more people, community issue, not technical issue. So my summary is my summary of listen to the recording and put them together as one slides. All right. So Pascal said that by definition, the ontologies is already fair and trust. However, it's very how can we reach that? And he's more like to focus on interoperable and reusable. But most of ontologies are very hard to reuse or usually solve very narrow use cases. So his point is that there is also US and EU differences. Europe has a lot of trainings in different domains, but in US, we seems concentrating on biomedical domain. And then he also talked about ask a question to the audience there, how do we change our way to develop ontologies? And he really talked about ontology design patterns, which I think the speaker following me will talk about this more. And I like that idea too, because then I think I see the variable like different ontologies existing. One of the reasons is that the computer scientist who is not a domain expert, they tends to create some version of ontology because of lack of domain expert support. So if we can come up with some small things that they can easily plug in, it will be very, very useful. But we have other problems on generating different versions of ontologies because of our knowledge and domain expert understanding of ontology is quite different. All right, and then Chris Mungo talked about the OBO interoperability pyramid. And he lists out the questions of how do we trust an ontology. So he also mentioned that reuse is a key. There are multiple criteria to say if I trust this ontology or not. I think his points was used by others in the community to kind of evaluate if the community will reuse this ontology or not. So that's good, great points. Well, so in summary, he also mentioned that the ontology used in life science stemming from the gene ontology, and even in gene ontology, the definition for gene is still not fully agreed till this day. So it's very, as I said, sometimes the consensus it's hard to reach consensus just because knowledge domain experts has their different understanding of what is a concept, what's their knowledge understanding of a concept. So the LinkML is a way to bring ontology to data. And then we started a group discussion, and we focus on how to bring ontology to domain experts. What does it mean by using ontology? And we also kind of touched the topic on CDEs, data and ontology. So regarding to how to bring ontology to domain experts, the opinion is that the best data management is that people don't know the management is there. So same as ontology. Ontology is used behind the system. The system doesn't need to know to tell that the ontology is used. But there is also funding and a policy problem to bring the ontology to the domain expert. Interface such as knowledge graph front, maybe it's a good vehicle to bring the ontology to the domain expert, so as a schema diagrams. And there are also other people talking about ontologies. When we talk about ontologies, it really scares primary researchers. And most people's understanding about ontologies may be hierarchy, but we have to emphasize that it's not just hierarchy, it is also semantics. And this person particularly saying that all the scientists in the lab should receive the training on good data generation practices and ontologies. So I hope that we can reach that by individual effort. I know Obo at the academy, I also teach at NIH, and others, they have YouTubes. So hopefully that can reach some level of training. Let me see next. What do I do next? Okay, then another thing is that we will need to make the ontology visible to end users. And in fact, the domain experts, if you teach them how to build an ontology, they actually benefit from this intellectual process of modeling a domain ontologically. It helps them to thought through and think about their field and expand their mind in the way they haven't thought before. This is great thought from Aura. And he also said that we want the world when the ontology is taught in high schools. And I totally agree. And ontology for high schoolers will really help them to study. Okay, so what does it mean by using ontology? Hierarchy is very useful. And usually community use ontology as a standard. Therefore, working with community is really important in ontology development. And another common theme of ontology's usefulness is that it can help to integrate data from diverse sources. However, different fields use it very differently. There are people use it to standardize the definition, which is not really useful for all the use cases that we have seen from this USTTS and the ICBO combined mixed community. So the use of ontology also, they use ontology as a schema for knowledge graph. And the types of use cases will determine the types and the approach to develop ontology. So there still will be a lot of differences of developing ontologies based on use cases. So what are the, how are use cases necessary for ontology? Of course, yes. Actually they say maybe not, because internet does not have use cases. So ontology may not need use cases. And then another thought is that ontology needs to go with data. And you can think about it most schema for data. And then for data analysis purposes, analysis relevant integration and curation are really intensive in this way. If all the data annotated by ontology terms, I think integration and the curation can be made very easier, a little bit easier. And then the machinery of ontology KG and RDF is reduce the cost of data preparation and making data reuse more effective. I hope you all agree with those. Those are the opinions from the discussion. And then we then discuss about the common data elements, the problems at NIH, because Susan Gregorick from the Office of Data Science and Strategy was sitting in the discussion, and we made it the topic. And we were saying that she was asking that is NIH creating monster, that each big initiative creates their own CDEs, and later we need very huge effort to harmonize those CDEs. And I have seen that again and again in all ICs, all big projects. So there is a Redux initiative. We use that as an example to illustrate that data centers, they were very quickly established to respond to COVID. And when Data Hub that was founded, they founded relevantly later than the data centers. So they found out it's very hard to harmonize those 500 CDEs or dictionaries that was founded before the Data Hub. So ideally, Data Hub is supposed to found it earlier, but yeah. So they took effort to normalize those CDEs or dictionaries using the NLM text mining tools to help them to find the matching concepts and then human identify the matchings. That is exactly what Ramona said earlier, that mapping terminologies takes a lot of effort. And then as we always see that repeated process everywhere, who will turn those repeated results process into tools, which is still open question. And then more discussion on CDE and ontologies. CDE is similar with controlled vocabulary. We as ontologists should advocate that a little bit tech add to controlled vocabulary will be a more longer-term useful ontology later. And OBO shows, OBO means OBO Foundry. OBO shows a prospective way rather than retrospective mapping. It really pays massive. So we need to make this words to be heard to the other communities who generated the huge data. And then ontology is really providing the constraints to constrain the meanings and the vocabularies. They're not capturing the definitions. One thing about ontology, that ontology is not just all file, it's all file plus the documentation. So oftentimes that ontology alignment is not successful because there was very little documentations for people to align them. Other thoughts are, some people also think ontology as CDMs are similar things. And some people also promote that perhaps we can do a micro or little semantic model to help using ontology to translate data schema that does not have semantics. And there is a need to identify the bottom level semantics for the data elements so that we find the sweet spot between the data elements, data common data models, and ontologies. There is also thought on ontology fabric building using good principles. So because not one model is absolutely correct, so this thoughts promotes that we should encourage build more ontologies if they follow in good principles. And then based on those amount of fabric ontologies, we then can come up with a master ontology that is more closer to the truth, because every one ontology was built is a one angle towards the truth. And this is more like a democratization of data and modeling. Here towards the end, we asked bioteam, Ira. He did some fair data capacities comparison across the pharma, US government, and academia. The red are the warning areas, so it shows that the government are really lack of government and the academia, especially government. Lack of data management, lack of knowledge on the data standards. But for pharma, the most important, most critical problem is data sharing, of course, because they think their data is proprietary. So that ends our, okay, we then just ask the opinion from the audience to give some advice to NIH, because at that time, NIH is planning to release the data management sharing policy, which is already released in January this year, and maybe I forgot date, but now every researchers who are applying the funding, they have to provide a data management plan. So data management is primarily missing in the biomedical research, and the FAIR supposedly to solve that problem, but FAIR is quite complex. Analogy with the internet pointing address to computers, the data-oriented network architecture, which in where each piece of data contains address and pointing to each other. So then the ontology works as a conceptual mapping of data and pointing to where the data belongs within the domain. Well, yep. So there is also sharing about what the risk of the NIH policy is, that researchers has no experience at all, but and the people also suggest that NIH should not make the same mistakes as in clinical, not mandate adoptions of the standards. That's NIH actually, they didn't make any mention of standards, which makes researchers are getting a little bit confused. But instead of that, NIH should be focusing on interoperability and not dedicate exact data model to use, provide principles and guidance. Yep, so this is a reminder of the FAIR principles and the trust principles, and that's all. Thank you so much. So my report may be like sparse because I was just summarizing the discussion. So some people who joined that call may remind you I think there are some useful points for us to continue. Yep, that's all from me.
Shai, I think we could talk a long time about this, but if one person has an important comment, we could take it here before going to Torsten. I think a lot of these issues will come up and be discussed more in 2 weeks when we have a synthesis session and a preparation for our communique. And so I think there's a lot of tabs here that will be thought about and written about as part of the communique. But with that, let me see if there's anybody raising their hand. I didn't see any questions on the other chat, although Shia, there were at least 2 comments over there. You might look over there and maybe have a response on that. Anybody have a quick comment, question? Okay, we're all shy. If not, let me turn it over to Torsten.
What is there another speaker now?
Yes, there is another speaker, Torsten Hahmann.
Okay. All right. So my comment was that data element is too small many times to have semantic meaning. It's the combination of data elements that has semantic meaning. And OWL is not the language which is semantically rich tagged language. It
Mhm.
just RDF framework only refers largely to web addresses and web. The content analysis is where semantic richness comes in picture. So these were
And I
my
guess
comments.
Sierra's presentation showed us a little bit about a way how to do some of that. Let's, for the sake of time, let's turn it over to Torsten now, and we can have more questions at the end if we have time.
Thank you.
All right. Can you actually see my screen? My slides?
Yes,
can see
we
it.
see it. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yes, thank you, Gary and James, for inviting me to speak here. And Ravi actually just raised the question that I'm trying to address here as well, namely what the role of domain reference ontologies are and how they're related to all these other pieces that we've been talking about, like patterns and things like that. So let me just give you kind of a brief, oh, there we go, definition of what I think of a domain reference ontology. And I'm not the only one that kind of using that term. Other people have been using kind of similar term. So there are essentially three criteria that we can use to classify ontology. We have like purpose, like what do you use the ontology for, the scope, how broad, like how generic or how specific it is, and then the representation format, like whether you use OWL, first order logic, some conceptual modeling language, RDF, whatever. So domain reference ontologies really kind of fit into the scope of what we sometimes also call domain ontologies. So they're different from like BFO or Dolce, things that we call top level ontologies. And they're also a little different from what I call here generic ontologies, which are about cross-cutting concerns like time, space, measurements, etc., that apply to many domains, but that are very specific set of concepts. Within the domain ontologies, we kind of think of domain reference ontologies as the ones that try to tie the domain together, that actually provide some concept to describe how different domain ontologies define concept in the same domain. So it's kind of trying to address the problem of that domain ontologies don't always agree, and no matter how long we try, we will never likely get everyone to agree to a common definition. So instead, we can kind of identify these aspects of how these definitions differ and provide that in the domain reference ontology, and then say, okay, this first domain ontologies uses this definition that differs from this second one. So with that choice, there comes two kind of additional aspect, namely that to be kind of reusable, it needs to be somehow foundationally grounded in like a top level ontology. I won't get into that in detail here. And ideally, you can actually specify it in a machine interpretable language to reason about these differences. It doesn't mean that this will be your ontology to use in a particular application or domain. It's more about reasoning about the differences across domain ontologies. So just kind of a schematic view. This is just kind of a very rough overview how I think about it. We have like these top level ontologies, and then we have like generic ontologies, domain reference ontologies, and domain ontologies. They're not kind of nicely stacked entirely, because there's always things that some domain ontology may use directly from a top-level ontology. The same with kind of generic ontologies. So they sit kind of side by side, but there's still this kind of hopefully coverage of a lot of the domain concept by a domain reference ontology. So one example that I've been working on for quite some time is called the Hydro Foundational Ontology, HYFO, as kind of an example of a domain reference ontology for the hydrology domain. And the reason we developed that was kind of because there's so many different ontologies about hydrology, about water, like surface water, groundwater, and they use concepts slightly differently. Even like legislation changes definition of concept, like what is a navigable river, for example, has been changed by fiat essentially. So one example where we use the HYFO is to kind of ground the GWML2, which is the groundwater markup language, in kind of more overarching concept that are common to all of water or hydrology. So the GWML doesn't have any grounding by itself. It has kind of some of these upper concepts like flow, earth material, hydrogeo unit, kind of disconnected from anything else. So we're not clear what the difference between, for example, a hydrogeo unit and earth material. So the HYFO essentially plays this role of connecting it to a foundational ontology like Dolce. It doesn't have to be Dolce, but it's just one that I'm using for illustration here, identifying these common concepts like that kind of sit in between here, that we can actually connect these GWML concept at the bottom to, and then we can do the same thing with other domain ontologies. Let's say we have surface water ontology, like we have similar concept, like the idea of a hydro rock body, for example. We have that both on the surface and the subsurface side. The void we have on the surface and on the subsurface side. So then we kind of see the similarities across domain ontologies, and then say, well, in a groundwater ontology, like the void has to have a certain configuration, namely that it's like underground rather than open to the top, where we call it a surface water body, and so on. So this is kind of just one example where we kind of we come down to this. We may call it pattern, but the domain reference ontology is more than the pattern. It's actually kind of an artifact that we can reuse, that we can use to define an ontology like GWML2, and we can actually share that. So if we go back to the slide here, we can actually have like an OWL file or a CLIF file, like for common logic, that has like this HYFO ontology, and then treat this as an extension, a logical extension of that ontology. So I'm not going to go into the details here. There's some references here if you're interested in looking at that. How does that actually help us now is that when we talk about something like a lake or a river, it may actually refer to different aspects in different domain ontologies. Like some ontologies say, well, a lake always has to have water, or a river always has to have water. But if you're talking about certain places in the world where there are rivers that are only seasonally occurring, then is it still true or not? Maybe we just need the container or as a void, like where the water would be if it's there. And so, so we can kind of talk about these differences in different domain ontologies, how they, like, what is essential, what is optional for their concepts of a water, what we call a water feature. So there's some other work in my group ongoing in the similar spirit. For example, for the forest ecology ontology, where we're trying to identify kind of the key concepts that we need that connect different ontologies. For example, like trees and tree species are different, forest and forested area are different things. And we're trying to connect it to existing ontologies, but also draw these distinctions that we feel like we need to make in order to talk about how different data sets or different domain ontologies think about these things. So often the question comes up, so how's it different from like an ontology design pattern? And I think the relationship here is really that a domain reference ontology, in the sense as I presented this, employs one or more pattern, but it's also an artifact that is reusable in itself. It's not just a template that you copy and then you need to fill in more detail. You can use the ontology, you can extend it. So it's kind of an ontology by itself. There's some other efforts going on in this direction. I won't talk about those in detail, but one thing that I thought might be relevant here. So there's a tool, McCloud, that's under development that we actually use to, like, most of these ontologies we developed in common logic, like the Cliff syntax, which is essentially first order logic with some syntactic sugar. But we developed this tool that can actually extract like an OWL version that you can actually reuse in a particular application, and that you can actually use to verify the ontology using OWL reasoners and identify more inconsistency. Like the kind of reasoning that's very expensive and very difficult with first order logic ontologies, because the reasoning is just not tractable. And so that's kind of one of the tools to support kind of the reuse of some of these domain reference ontology, because often, as Ravi said, like the semantic, like just formalizing what fits into OWL is often not enough. So this semantics often go deeper, and so we can capture that and then still get an OWL ontology if you want to. So that's all I have here. Just a little bit of advertising on the voice ontology that's coming up. So if you're interested in joining us, have a look at the website, and there's still workshops and ontology showcases that are soliciting papers if you have some work that you want to submit and present there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Torsten. And we have ample time, 4 minutes, for some follow-up. We should give priority to the OBO and biomedical folks to see if they have questions or comments on it, since they have something comparable in COB, or may have opinions on common logic.
Hey, thanks, Torsten. Yeah, my opinion on common logic is that it's been very difficult to use, and I hadn't heard of McCloud before. So yeah, I'll be interested in playing with that. Yeah, I've been thinking about COB as kind of, well, not an upper level ontology like BFO, but upper level to cover OBO. the biomedical domain and kind of adjacent things. That's how we've been thinking about it and trying to keep it small and communicate our modeling decisions through that. But yeah, the points you made here are great, and I want to think about them some more.
Well, Thorsten made the essential point. I think that you can get richer semantics out of it, then translate it down to the easier form, which is tractable. So that's an interesting combination. And I think, as he said, it gets a little bit at Ravi's question on your point, centrality of having good semantics.
I totally agree, James, that like common logic is not easy to write. We need the tools, otherwise it won't be usable by like a broad audience. And that's just kind of at the beginning there with the tools. Unfortunately, the tools support is always the most difficult because there's not a whole lot of funding for that.
Anything else from this group? I know Ravi has a question in the other chat, and he could speak up if he wants. Or he has a
Torsten?
comment at least. Yeah.
If others don't have question, my question is, in the reference ontology, domain reference ontology, are you trying to model a physics model of the subject, namely, say, hydrology, for example, or forestry, or are you trying to do more than physics? Are you trying to create a axiomatic, logical, or reasoning-based model rather than a physics model of the ontology?
What do you mean by a physics model of the ontology?
To me, hydrology is everything that happens is more or less physics or chemistry at the most, because physics would include flow and levels and pressures and stuff. And then, there are purities, impurities, other domains get mixed in because of the nature of hydrology, rocks and alluvial soils and hard stuff. So what I'm saying is that the hydrological people will use a lot of knowledge of physics and fluids to model something, a phenomenon.
Yeah, so you're talking about like.
So what is your domain reference ontology addressing? Those models, or are you creating a logical model of ontology and applying it to the domain?
It's still a logical model, like kind of what concepts we are talking about. It's not trying to do like modeling in the sense of like simulation of the processes, or I think that's probably too difficult.
Good. Then where does physics come in, Torsten?
I think the physics probably goes. It's much more detailed. I mean, that's really the kind of the scope of the specific application, like how, like essentially you can have a model, like a simulation kind of model that produces observations or predictions. And these predictions, observations are then essentially entities of your ontology.
Okay, I get some sense now. Thank you. Thank you. Good, great talk. Still very difficult, but great talk.
Nancy has a question or comment.
Yeah, I just want to say quickly, the idea of teaching ontology in high school, I was just thinking, my first thought is that would be a good thing because it would get people to think logically and be more precise, more detailed in how they think. So I think that would be good training. But then I think the danger in it is that you would have people think too simplistically and maybe come up with axioms that really don't fit, like say just looking out at a forest or something and trying to model, an ecosystem. I mean, there's so much that we don't know, and so when you start to write axioms, you may be wrong, and it would be a danger to then do reasoning over that. That's all I want to say.
We say we jump on the AI bandwagon, AI literacy bandwagon, and include knowledge literacy and maybe some of the tools that will help there. When people sort of try to bring programming down to that level, like they create simpler languages. So there may be some language simplifications and tools that we can use. It would be great to have a tool for common logic. People have sort of started on that, but haven't gotten very far. I had one comment before we go, if nobody else has anything. That I got interested when I heard about the effort, the forest ecological ontology, and I can see a possible path eventually to sort of do a little comparison with ENVO over time. So maybe there's a merger possibility or a sharing possibility in the future.
Yes, we're looking into that as well to kind of see what pieces we can reuse, what can we contribute to Envo. It's been difficult, let's put it that way.
Yeah. You know, Envo has been populated based on who's been interested in a particular part of the environment. It's all over the place. And, you know, we've, as we go back to it, we see things that need to be improved and fleshed out. And I think probably what you'll be doing would be a really big help with that. So look forward to that in the future. Any other comments or questions? We are at the magic hour. And if there aren't, I just want to invite people to come again next week because Martin Skiland, who couldn't present due to illness earlier, is going to be presenting on sort of a pattern and template-based approach to building ontologies with something called OTTR Otter, as James points out. So again, hopefully we'll have a good audience and an opportunity to get a little bit more ideas on easier ways to build quality ontologies. And with that, I thank everybody for coming and look forward to seeing you again in a week.